Hi everyone, we'll be waiting 2 to 3 minutes before starting the webinar to accommodate for the rest of the attendees who are in the middle of connecting. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us and thanks for being part of our community. My name is Valon Kalika and I'll be your host for today. Few reminders before we start. If you have issues viewing the stream at any time during the presentation and are using the web browser version of Teams, please refresh your browser. If you're using the desktop app of Teams, please exit and rejoin. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared publicly. We will post the recordings on our community at aka.ms/security-webinars. Closed captions in several languages are available during the live broadcast. You can enable them by clicking on the CC button located at the lower right corner of your screen. Feel free to ask questions at any time by typing them in the live event Q&A window by clicking on the Ask Question button. Be aware that any questions you post will be publicly visible. However, if you prefer, you can post your question anonymously by checking the box right below where you enter it. We often get many questions on these webinars and we will do our best to respond to all of them in real time. In the event if the answer was not provided, or if you may have additional questions post this event, please don't hesitate to raise them on our Microsoft Security and Compliance forum at aka.ms/security-community-Q&A. If you're listening to this after the fact as a recording, that's also a great place to ask a question. We'd love to hear your feedback on how we can improve these webinars in general. You can do so at aka.ms/security-webinar-feedback. I would also like to invite you to join our public community by visiting aka.ms/security-community. That's the best way to ensure you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements. On our community, you can speak directly to our engineering teams that create our security products. You'll be able to influence our product designs and get early access to changes by doing things like participating in private previews. And you can sign up for that at aka.ms/security-prp. You can request features, give feedback, review our product roadmaps, register for events, or join webinars like this. We believe that the best way to improve our products is by removing any barriers between you and the people that create them. So we hope you'll join us. Today's guest is Tom Burt, who will discuss the Microsoft Digital Defense Report key findings. Tom is our CVP of Customer Security and Trust. Jordan Ross is also with us today, who will guide us in the discussions on how security products can be leveraged in mitigating the related threats. Jordan is a program manager with our Security CXE team, and without further ado, I will turn it over to Tom. Tom, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about the Digital Defense Report. We published our first Microsoft Digital Defense Report this past September, really 6 months into the global pandemic. And the report is a reimagining of what a report that we used to issue called the Security Intelligence Report. But what we decided to do this time was to really work to consolidate all the cybersecurity data and insights that we have across the entire Defender community at Microsoft, collect that information, organize it into a digestible and readable form, and publish it for the benefit of our customers and in the public interest. The report is 86 pages long, and it's been extremely well received in the security community. So today I wanted to take the opportunity to introduce you to the report and take you through just a few of the highlights, but they are just excerpts of the report, and I commend the entire report to you because it's just packed with data, information, and advice for customers. What we're going to talk about today, the agenda, really tracks the structure of the report itself. And in addition, after I talk about each of the chapters that are outlined here, Jordan will walk through the products and services that we have that help our customers address the key concerns that I highlight as we walk through the report. So I want to start with just a little bit more about how the report was put together. You know, the inspiration from the report came from really understanding the scope of the work that our Defender community all up does. We talk about, 8 trillion signals a day coming into Microsoft, and you can see just a number of the data points on this slide. The almost breathtaking volume of information and data that we work with every day to protect our customers, blocking 3 billion threats as just one example. That scope of activity, that scope of work, and that scope of data was something that we prior to this report had not really done a good job consolidating and communicating out to our customers to really help both our customers and the broader digital ecosystem really understand what we were seeing, what insights that we could bring to the community from this work across all of the company. We built the report through consultations with a number of people across the Defender community. We built these cohorts that we talked with to understand what they were seeing, what they thought over the past year was really relevant to communicate, and we came up with these 4 key topics: the state of cybercrime, nation-state threats, security in the remote workforce, and then actionable learnings. We wanted to make sure that we did not just present problems, but that we also talked about what customers and the broader ecosystem could do to address those problems. And we're going to walk through each one of these, but I do want to acknowledge the great cooperation that my team in customer security and trust had in working across the company. And you can see all the different organizations that participated and contributed to the Microsoft Digital Defense Report listed here on the slide. So with that, let's jump in and talk about some of the highlights that we saw in the report. And I'm going to start by talking about cybercrime. It's the first section of the report, and the reason for that is that it remains by far the broadest challenge that our customers face. Is cybercrime that's being conducted for the purpose of stealing money one way or another from our customers and from the ecosystem. It's an ongoing challenge for both private and public sectors, and we have concluded that we can't view this as a specific criminal or a specific attack. We need to understand that cybercrime increasingly is being driven by a number of very sophisticated syndicates operating as enterprises, looking to maximize the return on their investment through sophisticated business analysis. And we're going to talk about some of that and some of the insights that we describe in the report. But again, this is the largest section of the report, so the report goes into a great amount of detail that I won't be covering today. One of the things that's clear from the report as a whole is that these criminal organizations are skilled and relentless. They constantly evolve their techniques very rapidly to increase their success rates. And they experiment with different approaches, for example, different phishing lures, and they adjust the kinds of attacks that they execute, both to hide themselves from law enforcement and detection, but also to increase the return on their investment, which they evaluate through very sophisticated business analysis we know from dark web research. And we also see that these syndicates are actively recruiting, including recruiting against us and others on the legitimate side of the technology community as they look for skilled cybersecurity experts to help them conduct their criminal enterprises. What this graph shows is just one example of how agile these criminal enterprises are. And what you see on that top graph is how rapidly criminals responded to the events of the COVID-19 pandemic as they re-engineered what they were doing to try to increase their returns. Now, it's important to understand, and we saw this and we've seen it confirmed from others who were watching the scope of criminal activity, the total volume of cybercrime did not increase appreciably during the pandemic. But what we did see, and what you see on that top graph, is that the use of COVID-19 themed phishing lures, the kinds of emails, the topics and the subject matters of emails and other lures that criminals used to try to get victims to click on documents or links or to surrender credentials, those lures became very heavily oriented towards COVID-19 topics rapidly. You see, March 11th is when the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. And already, even before that, there was a significant bump in the increase of COVID-19 themed lures, and then it peaked after that. Then it decreased. And what we've seen is there's a constant underlying volume of lures that continue to be COVID-19 theme based. And I anticipate as we see vaccines beginning to be distributed, you're going to see lures that are vaccine access oriented and maybe even anti-vax oriented lures as the criminals try to use the most current social issues to drive their success rates. And we've seen this about other topics too. Black Lives Matters topics, campaign and election fraud topics, everything that is front of mind, especially in world discourse, but also in discourse in the US, rapidly become adopted as the themes of the phishing lures that the cyber criminals use. One of the key kinds of cybercrime that we focus on in the report is business email compromise. So this is it's really a form of phishing primarily, in which the criminals are trying to get access to a business and in which they can successfully pose as somehow a legitimate participant in a business email thread so that they can get money sent to an account that they've set up. And they have to defraud and trick the business or key people in the business into believing that this request for money transfer is actually legitimate, when of course it's not legitimate at all. And it's an incredibly successful form of cybercrime. We've seen that the cyber criminals have moved away from particular kinds of attacks and moving towards phishing attacks as their means of harvesting credentials. There's some good news. in 2019, Microsoft technology blocked 13 billion malicious and suspicious emails. More than 1 billion of those were URLs that were set up for the explicit purpose of launching phishing attacks. But we also know that a very large number of attacks nevertheless got through, and the cyber criminals continue to be effective. We see them through our Office 365 telemetry. We see them engaging in credential phishing. We see them, again, doing business email compromise, and we see a combination of attacks that combine credential phishing and business email compromise. One of the techniques that we've seen cyber criminals do, once they're in a system, and if they can compromise the credentials of a particular person that's involved in some part of the financial side of the business, is they will go into that email account and set forwarding rules. This is very effective for two reasons. One is it enables them to use keywords to recognize when within the business operation of a particular function, some regular transfer of funds is going to occur in some way, and then to jump in with an email that redirects that transfer of funds to their account in some way that appears legitimate. These forwarding rules also help them because if they're detected, and if the enterprise that detects that they've been hacked then reacts, as many do, by resetting passwords, but the enterprise does not go in and carefully check forwarding rules, which is not something that typically happens, then even though they think they've gotten the attacker out of their system and they think they've prevented them from being effective because they have changed passwords, the attacker is still there seeing those emails because of the forwarding rules. And we're seeing this happen not just with cyber criminals, but with nation state attackers as well, as a way to stay persistent even when you think you've got them out of a system. The attacks that continue to evolve, they increasingly use cloud services and other approaches. And this is an area where we have to continue to focus. The Digital Crimes Unit has an active program working with the defender community to combat business email compromise. Ransomware is the #1 growth industry in the cybercrime world. And I'm sure that you've all seen the many press reports on successful ransomware attacks that have really flooded the country and the world over the past 18 months. The Microsoft Detection and Response Team, the DART team, which is our team of cybersecurity experts that responds directly to customers, engages with customers both to help them protect and harden their systems, but also to respond when they've been attacked. DART has observed that ransomware is the most common reason behind incident response engagements over the past year. And we see that also from our threat protection intelligence. And what's interesting is the most troubling form of ransomware is what is known as human-operated ransomware. And this is where once the cyber criminal has successfully intruded into the network, there's an actual human on a terminal who then operates the ransomware attack so that they can migrate through that network environment in a controlled way in order to find where the most useful data is, where the most valuable data is, so that when they do launch their ransomware attack, they can be the most impactful and the most effective. And for some time, the view in the community has been that these targeted human-operated ransomware attacks, or so-called big game ransomware, will pick a target, attack that target, and then work to ransom that target. But it turns out our data shows that that's really the exception. It's not the rule. Most major ransomware attacks over the past year, while they are human-operated ransomware gangs, what they do is they start by performing these massive, wide-ranging sweeps of the internet, searching for vulnerable entry points that they've already determined to look for, and then they bank that information and then wait for a time to attack an industry, a segment, or even a single target when it's most advantageous to them and has the best prospect of yielding significant returns on ransomware. And we saw an example of that just this fall when we saw ransomware attacks really going after the healthcare industry that was both responding to COVID-19 and also developing vaccines, because these cybercriminal syndicates understood that this was a particularly vulnerable time for that industry, during which the delay of trying to reestablish their systems without ransoming their data was just not tenable. And so they assumed correctly that they would find that they would get paid by many of their targets if they went after that particular industry, as heartless as such an attack is. And this is despite the fact that at the outset of the pandemic, several of the largest cyber criminal syndicates openly pledged not to attack the healthcare targets during this time. But several months into the pandemic, they discarded that promise and indeed attacked with success. And the impact of this on our customers and on the ecosystem really can't be overstated. And we are now in the process across the company of resourcing a significant effort to combat ransomware. And this is across identity and response. And we have set up a new ransomware program in the digital crimes unit that's going to work with all of the rest of the Defender community to work on solutions for how we can better protect our customers from ransomware, and how we can work with law enforcement and others to respond to ransomware attacks and do a better job identifying and prosecuting or disrupting the activity of cyber criminals. Another area that we address in our Microsoft Digital Defense Report is the increasing threat to Internet of Things devices. The total number of devices in 2019 of IoT devices reported to be 26 or so billion active devices. And it's estimated that by 2022, just a year and a half from now, that number will have roughly doubled to over 50 billion devices. And while there is increasing discussions about manufacturers of such devices having a responsibility to design their products securely, that's not necessarily happening. I just saw a study published, I think it was yesterday, in which researchers had cataloged dozens of easy vulnerabilities in billions of IoT devices that were being actively marketed today. Microsoft is doing a number of things to try to work on systems to improve the security of IoT devices. But that nevertheless, this large volume of these smart devices connected to the internet is an incredibly attractive target to cyber criminals. One of the things that Mystic has done, the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, which we work very closely with in working on how to combat cybercrime and nation state attacks, is they deployed honeypots to mimic the likely targets, IoT targets that they've deployed over Azure and a range of other cloud providers. And the honeypots seek to engage attackers so that we can learn more about the techniques they're using to attack IoT devices. And this graph just shows the data on the total attacks on our deployed honeypots over the last year and a half. And you can see the constant increase in this activity. So we know these threats are expanding. We know they're increasing and they're becoming more sophisticated. In many cases, the principal use of these attacks and the control of IoT devices is to use them to launch DDoS attacks. But we're also seeing more sophisticated uses. The Digital Crimes Unit just a month ago took down the TrickBot botnet, a very complex and challenging botnet that was one of the most infamous botnets, especially in the financial community around the world. And we were also seeking to disrupt it as a potential means of distributing ransomware to interfere with the 2020 election. It took about 10 days of 24/7 activity by our Digital Crimes Unit team to fully bring down the TrickBot botnet distribution architecture. And one of the reasons for that was that the people behind TrickBot did a had a very inventive, creative approach to their architecture for the botnet that not only was global, but used a number of IoT devices, especially routers, as simplistic CNC components in their architecture. So identifying those devices and then determining how we could break the communication of the architecture with those devices was part of the creative work that the team had to do. And it also enabled the operators of the TrickBot botnet to rapidly stand up new devices as we took devices down. In the end, after a week and a half, 2 weeks of constant activity and vigilance, we now believe that we've got the TrickBot architecture fully remediated. But of course, those criminals will move on to establish new botnets and new techniques for distribution because the money's out there. But we were able to disrupt this particular architecture and get it neutered in the ecosystem, which is something we were very happy to do. In the process, we learned a lot about how cyber criminals are using IoT devices, and we expect to see that continue. We had some very interesting data that we could produce in the Microsoft Digital Defense report about IoT devices because of our recent acquisition of CyberX. And this data came from CyberX, but you can see just how vulnerable IoT devices are because of the versions of unpatched Windows that they are operating, the fact that they have passwords that are unencrypted, or in many cases, they are pre-established by the factory. They're sent out with default passwords and they never get updated by the users. Users just install these devices, whether they are sophisticated enterprises or consumers at home. It doesn't seem to matter. People just don't think of changing the default passwords on these devices. And there's a number of other ways in which these devices, you can see from the data here, are very vulnerable to attack and therefore something that cyber criminals find irresistible in their efforts. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Jordan, who's going to talk about how our products and services can help our customers address these issues.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tom. So with the types of vulnerabilities that you were raising, there's a number of products that we have today that for y'all that are on the call and for y'all viewing the recording, you can already benefit from. Looking at the threats coming in that address phishing and the different ways that attackers are targeting users directly. Within Microsoft Defender for Office 365, there's already by default anti-phishing policies. So if you go to the policy section of Office 365 or the Microsoft Defender offering for it, you can already look at those policies there. You can customize them to your organization and make them stricter wherever needed. This is a way that you protect your users from being targeted and from lateral movement attacks from eventually happening and widespread attacks against your organization. In addition to that, there's also Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, and this really discusses the split between Microsoft Defender and Azure Defender. And with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, you're looking at your actual devices, the endpoints to your organization. And to look at ransomware-based attacks, there's actually an attack simulator that you can use. And you can look to see how your organization is prepared for something from WannaCry being detected. Detection of these types of attacks is highly critical, especially to stop it from further progressing. And so you can look to the alert section for Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, but you can also look at the recommendations there. And so by going to Microsoft Defender's Security Center, you can view all of these recommendations, understand what your exposure is, and address your biggest vulnerabilities. Understand what zero-day attacks can be mitigated by implementing those recommendations and stop ransomware and detect it in the future, which is a huge issue. On the Azure side, looking at the Azure Defender offering, there's Azure Defender for IoT. This is integrated with Azure Defender, so for those of y'all that are using Azure Security Center, you can go to the Defender view and see all of the recommendations related to IoT from one spot. And in addition to that, view the attacks, the detections from one spot within Azure Defender. The policies that Azure Defender for IoT surfaces, or the recommendations and the alerts, show you where you can detect where these kind of endpoints are being contacted, as well as determining within these where there's open ports on the device, permissive firewall policies found, and permissive firewall rules. All of these detections, all of these recommendations consolidated within the Azure Defender area. But on top of that, one that I didn't list out here that came to mind as we were talking was Azure WAF. So even within Application Gateway or Azure Front Door, you can look at the WAF policies, and by default, you can enable the bot mitigation rule sets too, to look at where activity isn't expected from bot-based attacks and prevent that on layer 7 of your network to prevent those attacks from further increasing. All right, Tom, back to you.
Thanks. So I want to turn to nation state attacks. These are attacks by organizations who, through their activity, their pattern of activity, the nature of the attacks that they make, and other data, we're able to conclude are organizations that are seeking to do the work of another country, and usually at the direction or control of that country's government. And the Mystic team is the primary team at Microsoft that tracks the activity of these teams. They are agile and they're sophisticated and they're incredibly well resourced. They are a huge challenge for us and for all of our customers, especially our government customers, but our enterprise customers as well. You may have seen the press yesterday about a recent successful attack on FireEye that FireEye has attributed to a nation state attacker, and they're still working to understand that attack better, as are teams here at Microsoft. But these are the kinds of sophisticated attacks that we face. And both WannaCry and NotPetya, those hugely destructive attacks, were nation state attacks conducted in part to demonstrate the capacity of nation state actors to cause massive economic disruption. So Mystic tracks about 70 or more different activity groups. And when it develops enough information to have confidence about the geography from which that group is operating, and that they have consistent information about how that group operates so that they feel confident in their ability to track the activities of a particular group, we give it these element names. And then, as you know, in the security industry, every company that tracks these different actors gives them different names. And so you always have to track the actors by a wide range of names. There's APT numbers from one vendor. We use these element names. Others use names like Keyhole Panda or Charming Kitten as the names for these organizations. Or if it's an organization operating out of Russia, you often hear names like Fancy Bear or Cozy Bear. Mystic tracks roughly 70 or so actors, but with the resources they are able to track about 30 actors very closely at any given time. And over time, they will shift which of the actors they track most closely, depending on which ones they see being the most active, being the most concerning. In the Microsoft Digital Defense Report, we published this chart, really giving the public a lot of information about the actors that we track most closely and where they operate from. And as you can see, and is consistent with what the rest of the security industry sees, the vast majority of the attacks come from these four countries: Iran, China, Russia, and North Korea. Although we also, in this case, listed an active group that operates from South Korea. We track all of this information and the different kinds of organizations that these attack groups tend to go after, so that we can provide information to our customers and to the broader ecosystem about the activity of these groups. This supports our efforts internationally to develop stronger cybersecurity policy, our efforts to get the international community to establish rules of conduct by nation state actors in cyberspace that are enforceable rules. And this is a work that my team continues to work on, both with the Paris Call effort, the United Nations efforts, and other international diplomatic efforts. And we do this work so that we can better inform all of our defender community how to build better, stronger, more resilient services into our products so that we can protect our customers better. We've also, within my organization, built a threat analyst team. This is a team of experienced nation state analysts who've come from the intelligence community, who have deep local language skills, and who are working very closely, really tight at the hip to Mystic, so that we are, that team is quite aware of what we are seeing, and then reviewing what is going on in each country, what's happening there, what we see in terms of their political stance, their foreign policy, and so that we can track and analyze not just what these actors are doing, but why they are doing it. And you will see much more of that analysis being published to the public in the coming months, and it will be a key component of the next edition of the Microsoft Digital Defense Report next fall. But the work that we've done so far has really highlighted some very interesting insights about nation state activity. And one of the things we do through Mystic, when Mystic identifies a customer that is threatened or attacked by a nation state actor, we then issue a nation state notification. We will contact the customer and say, we've seen that you are under attack by a nation state actor. Here are some threat indicators and some other information that you can use to watch for this attack, or if it's been a compromise and not just attack, here's information and resources from Microsoft to help you identify where they are in your network and get them out. We've taken that nation state notification data and consolidated it to see what insights we could learn that we could inform the public about, and this is in the Digital Defense Report. And there's some very interesting things. If you look at that top left donut, you'll see the country of activity origins, and this is for the prior year, so July 2019 to June 2020. And you'll see that by far the most active groups were operating from Russia, followed by Iran. China was in third place, and last was North Korea and some others as well. And then you can see in the lower left where geographically the targets of that activity were located. And that's also very interesting. I was speaking to a number of people in Canada just a few days ago, and they were quite intrigued to see that Canada was number 3 in the world in terms of the most frequently targeted geographic locations. But maybe one of the most interesting things is in that lower right corner, because one of the things that we've learned is that the vast majority of these nation state attacks during that year were targeting governmental and espionage targets. Oh, excuse me, we're not done with that slide yet. Targeting espionage targets, not critical infrastructure or private enterprise for disruption purposes. And that's based on the 13,000 nation state notifications we've done over the prior 2 years. So that's an interesting insight that's useful as we think about policy, as we think about how to address these nation state attackers. While we have seen them engage in these serious disruption activities, the vast majority of what they do is intended to conduct espionage, to find and extract and exfiltrate data and information, more so than to be disruptive. So we see from all of this a number of things that provide some additional insights that we discuss in the report. We see that the operational aims are primarily espionage, more so than disruption or destruction, although we know that the latter is still possible and can be very impactful. We see these common attack techniques of reconnaissance, of establishing malware in the system, of harvesting credentials, and increasingly attacks on virtual private networks. And then there's just a couple of examples of the ways in which we see this this happening. We're increasingly seeing large volume brute force attacks as being a primary means for nation state actors to infiltrate an organization. So something like this example of Contoso, where they will use a wide range of automated systems to just attack a huge number of different different credentials with a wide range of different passwords in order to just break in, because they only have to be right once, whereas the defender has to be right all the time. And then they also will do more phishing types activities. As you see here, a group that we call Thallium, using things like the classic RN instead of an M in a spoofed version of a Microsoft address, in which they're trying to convince people to click on a link or enter credentials so they can steal credentials and infiltrate the system. And so I'm going back now to Jordan to talk about the products and services we have that can help our customers defend against these attacks.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Really, the one that I want to highlight here is Azure Sentinel. As I discussed previously, there were these different portals, these different views across IoT, across Defender for Endpoint to view threats. And as you discussed, there's Microsoft Threat Intelligence, where we're looking for these suspicious signals all the time and informing our customer within our products. But Azure Sentinel is really the product that can consolidate all of these signals. And on top of that, there are already a set of rules. I believe there's 10 of them right now within the product itself that are there by default that you can use to determine nation state-based attacks. And they're classified by those table of elements names that you listed out previously. And so the way we group these out is by the known actor group. So whether it's phosphorus, gallium, or so on, even zinc, we list out the type of attack that we see, the type of threat intelligence signals that are related to them. And all you have to do is enable these analytic rule queries within Sentinel. And so for those of y'all that are using it, just going to the analytics section and doing something as simple as a search for the word known. Usually that will highlight all of the known nation state-based actor analytic rules that we have in the product. Again, there's always more analytic rules to determine types of activity in our security community. So going to the Azure Sentinel GitHub community, you can always find more. But for each of these kind of threat indicators that we see for each of these nation state actors, we show what data sources are relevant for them. And what you'll see as you look through these, it's not just from Microsoft resources that we're scanning across to see whether these attacks have occurred. One analytic rule, which is a suspicious signal that we find for Iridium, can go across Office 365, DNS, Azure Monitor, Cisco ASA, Palo Alto networks, the list goes on. And so we really tried to do a mapping and a graph-based approach to determine where can this activity be identified and how can we bring it to the front of your attention in Sentinel via an incident. All right, Tom, I guess it's time for the next section.
Thanks. So I want to talk about security in the remote workforce and some of the insights that we derived, which probably won't come as a big surprise to any of you, but which was really interesting information for our customers and the community. And this is some of the data that we showed. It's just simply the employee badge scans for the buildings on Microsoft campus to show how quickly Microsoft transitioned from a workforce that was largely working in the office in Microsoft buildings to a workforce working almost entirely from home. And you can see we went from roughly 100,000 badges a day, badge access into buildings, to around 7,000 very quickly after the company concluded that we should all work from home to respond to the pandemic. That 7,000 are the essential workers, for the most part, those who have to be in facilities to operate our facilities, to operate our data centers, to do critical work that can only be done from Microsoft campuses. But it's still a huge change in how we did our work. Now, in the case of Microsoft, because of the work of DSRE in moving the company towards this zero trust strategy for internal security, we found that we could adapt to this quite rapidly. And the company maintained a high degree of productivity, and that was being measured across a number of different productivity data points. But the company maintained a very high degree of productivity while maintaining a high degree of security, because we had already done a lot of work towards moving towards a zero trust strategy, where every access is assumed to be untrusted until it's established to be trusted, where we made sure that only devices managed by the company could access Microsoft resources. And then the other work that we did to ensure that that people only have access to those network resources they really must have, and that those that people with broad access to the network were kept to the very minimum number of people, and even then limit access to network resources just to those people absolutely have to do their job. That and a number of the other steps that were taken really enabled the company to operate a remote workforce with a high degree of security. And the learnings from all of that are things that we can then use to work with our customers and the ecosystem to improve security. One of the things that we saw through this process was the increase in DDoS attacks. And you'll see the trend since the beginning of the COVID outbreak in DDoS attacks. And they increased around the world. Sometimes they were really just smoke screens for attackers who were trying to ensure that the security defenders at a particular enterprise were diverted by the DDoS attack while they actually inserted malware to conduct a ransomware attack or some other cyber criminal activity, and the DDoS was simply a diversion. We mitigated 600 to 1,000 DDoS attacks every day in March, which was 50% more than pre-COVID levels. So they took the opportunity of people working from home, of these remote workplace situations, to really disrupt the activity of an enterprise by conducting a DDoS attack so that the remote workforce was unable to access the corporate or enterprise services and network, and therefore effectively shut down the operation of these enterprises through the DDoS attacks. We also saw an increase in identity-based attacks, and we're seeing this continue since we wrote the report even up till today. Azure Active Directory saw a significant increase in identity-based attacks using brute force on these enterprise accounts during the first half of 2020, as you can see. And you also can see a significant increase post-pandemic in the number of requested multi-factor authentication enablement requests, as more enterprises recognized the need to establish multi-factor authentication to ensure identity of their workforce and of those who are accessing their network. And back to Jordan.
Great, thanks, Tom. So as you discussed, Azure DDoS attacks, or those volumetric-based attacks, can critically slam an organization and shut down their web operations. And so something built into Azure is Azure DDoS by default. And so that means that the services running maybe within a VNet are protected within a region from being the basis of a DDoS attack. But if you want to protect your public-facing IPs directly, so rather than the Azure region or the data center as a whole, but this DDoS protection specifically for your public-facing IPs or the resources within your VNets, it's really up to you to turn on Azure DDoS standard on those to protect it from those volumetric-based attacks. It's relatively simple to turn on the service, and it's consolidated within Azure Security Center too. So there are recommendations wherever it's recommended or applicable. You can see that within Security Center's network-based recommendations. The other networking capabilities within Azure Security Center also show you your network topology. So understanding how your network can be compromised, the first step is understanding how your network relates to itself. So what kind of servers are out there, how they relate to the VNets and the subnets, all within subscriptions, and whether traffic is being allowed internally or externally. Azure Security Center provides you with that topology so that you can view and understand what kind of compromises can occur. And on top of that, there will be a giant red exclamation mark on each of those servers where the vulnerabilities are present, where you can reduce the basis of those attacks going forward. On top of that, some of those recommendations include this machine learning empowered network hardening. So it looks at your network security groups and recommends rules to reduce overly permissive networks. And the worst case scenario is a breach does occur. There are networking based alerts that can populate, and that's via the Azure Defender area of Azure Security Center. On the information side, Azure Information Protection is used to classify sensitive organizational data, label information that is highly critical, and prevent it from being exposed or the target of an insider threat as well. Looking at Azure Active Directory, this is really the tool of choice that we have to implement multi-factor authentication. Passwords are a massive target, whether they're being kept in organizations within notepads, online, or physically by a desk. Passwords are the source of an attack. And as is noted in the report, there's even packages that you can purchase, lists of passwords. And so going beyond that, looking at implementing multi-factor authentication is a way that you can move past that basis of attacks. Looking at Azure Security Center, this is where you can see a recommendation that Security Center has of subscriptions and the roles associated to them. So readers, people that have permission to edit, and people that own different resources, and how you can implement multi-factor authentication easily for each of those groups of people. Oversight and understanding of these vulnerabilities is key, and really Azure Security Center brings all of these elements into one spot so you can view it.
Thanks, Jordan. So one other thing that we talk about in the report that we thought was quite important to do was not just to tell our customers and the public about the problems, but to help them with some actionable learning, some ideas and advice for what they could do to better protect themselves. And we talk about 20 of them in the report. When I talk about the report publicly, I usually emphasize these 5 things as being key things that customers can do. The first one is adopt multi-factor authentication. You probably saw the blog post, I think it's more than a year old now, that our identity team did, but they looked closely at data and concluded that 99% of all attacks would have been prevented if the target had multi-factor authentication set up. Now, multi-factor authentication all by itself is not perfect, and we shouldn't pretend that it is perfect. And just recently, we've published within the company advice to customers on avoiding the more insecure forms of multi-factor authentication in favor of more secure forms of multi-factor authentication. But the data nevertheless shows that the vast majority of attacks could be prevented if people would just have multi-factor authentication on all their accounts. Good email hygiene is critical as well. This is both in terms of recognizing and being careful about not getting phished, but it also means things like regularly checking your forwarding rules to see if there's some rules you don't recognize that are set up there. That both would indicate that there's been an adversary in your system and that your account is being owned by an adversary and you want to turn those rules off. Patching your applications and systems. Again and again, we see that major attacks like WannaCry and NotPetya are not successful on systems that are fully updated with our newest technologies and that are fully patched. And getting enterprises to understand how critical it is to have a routine practice of adopting our patches and the patches of everyone else in the community, all other vendors, including our competitors, is critical to having good hygiene that will prevent the vast majority of these attacks. You know, limiting access with least privilege, as I talked about with our zero trust approach here at Microsoft, ensuring that you only have the privileges that are essential to doing your work, and that significantly reduces the ability of the adversaries to attack. And then slowing attacks with network segmentation. And let me turn this back again to Jordan to talk about how our products and services can help with these things.
Yeah, I don't want to eat up too much time since we're running a little short now, but here's really a recap of everything that Tom said and that I discussed previously in the product spotlights as we were going. And so across those top recommendations, these are really the products and services that we have and hopefully you have in your organization today, where you can start to mitigate and prevent these attacks from occurring. So whether it's multi-factor authentication, which I just talked about, good email hygiene, which you can implement with Microsoft Defender for Office 365. There's even a capability there for mailbox intelligence, where it can review your users' activity and to prevent suspicious activity or phishing attempts from originating from them that you can activate. Patching apps and systems, one product I didn't talk about, Microsoft Cloud App Security, to do so, and viewing all of these vulnerabilities across all of these products, and really they're centralized in two places, Azure Defender / Azure Security Center and the Microsoft 365 Defender area. So I believe that's a security.microsoft.com area to view it. And then where attacks can always happen is hitting your network. And so making sure your network is segmented and that protections and policies are put in place across each layer 3, 4, and 7 as you're going. So implementing that through Azure Firewall for layer 3 and 4, and layer 7 for web application firewall. But I want to make sure that we have time for questions and if there's anything that the security community wanted to call out too. So I guess we'll move over to the next slide and do some Q&A.
Thank you, Tom and Jordan. Just before Q&A, I would like to quickly survey our community, since this is our early stage of covering fundamentals of cybersecurity threats, of world problems, that is, as opposed to our typical sessions of covering the security product related topics. So I would like to ask our audience here via a quick survey. Let me share the screen. I have posted the link to the survey, and I will also share the results. So we'll give it here a few seconds to get the answers. And it is paulev.com/security webinar. Okay, well, this is great. Looks like we have the majority here, and this is great to hear. And we'll continue in the future to host more webinars like this. And let me go back to the Q&A slide, and we'll go back to you guys.
Okay. So we only probably have time for one question. I know other questions have been answered in the chat window, but Tom, one that I'm seeing across the responses here are, why are only threats regarding the countries listed in the report documented? Is there other activity that is documented if they dig deeper in the report, or why the focus on those ones? Tom, are you still there?
Hi, I'm sorry. I'm experiencing network issues and I missed the question entirely.
No worries, hopefully not a network attack. So the question is, why is there a focus on the countries that you listed out within those regions of the world, and why aren't other actors across the world documented?
Mystic tracks other actors around the world, but those are the countries from which the vast majority of nation state activity is occurring. And that's why we track those actors, because they're responsible for most of the activity. But we do track actors from every region of the world, including actors from, the Western countries as well. And where we see activity relevant to them, we also notify our customers about that activity. But it is, in comparison by volume, much less than what we see from Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea.
Thanks. So since we're at the top of the hour, if we could share the next slide, which really points out where our viewers can look at the report going forward. And so, Valen, is there something that you wanted to share here?
Yes. Basically, just wanted to remind the folks that we will have a webinar tomorrow on advanced architecture on Azure network security. So if you haven't registered yet, please do so by visiting us at aka.ms/security-webinars. And in case we missed to answer your question, or if you think of additional questions post this webinar, please do so by visiting us at the Microsoft Security and Compliance Forum at aka.ms/security-community Q&A. I would like to close this webinar by thanking Tom and Jordan for an excellent presentation. And thank you for the team who helped us answer the questions. And I would thank all of you for being part of our community and for joining us on these webinars. We hope to see you next time. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.